Welcome along, enjoying the last day of Summit. Hope your brains are all suitably exploded with all the cool stuff that's been happening. Did everyone go to the keynote yesterday with Tara? Cool, so you've probably got that little bit of a taste for the ideas around security and what's happening. So hopefully what I can give you today will lead on a bit from that, give you a bit more that you can actually take away and start looking at some practical aspects of improving things in the security world with your data. Just a reminder, just make sure you've got everything switched off. Let's not have any big disturbances. And a bit of a reminder, if anybody hasn't seen everything yet, just all the stuff that PASS is offering. I'm sure the fact that you're all here means you're pretty much aware of everything that goes on and have had a good look into and use out of all these resources. A quick bit about myself. I've traveled from Melbourne, Australia to get here and present to you this week. It's always a fun journey. It's always nice coming this way. It seems to work nicely. It's just when I go back, I'll have about 6 weeks worth of jet lag to get over. I'm a consultant with Telstra Purple over there, one of the largest consultancies in Australia. Across all sorts of things, we've got about 1,500 consultants in total. I've been a data platform MVP for 5 years, a Microsoft certified trainer for 8. I run the SQL Saturday in Melbourne, which is setting up as quite a nice event. We generally get close to 300 people at that. So if you ever want to time your holidays in, come down, see a bit of Australia, join in with some SQL Saturdays down there. We kind of work it together of try and get a couple back-to-back, so it kind of helps if you want to come that way. And I kind of like to say I started with SQL Server in the last century, back in the 6.5 days. So been around, seen a lot of changes with things over the years and how that's developed. And just a reminder, I'll do it just now because I'll probably forget at the end, but just your session evaluations will be really, really useful for me to get and see how I've performed for you today. So what are we going to cover with this session? I'm going to go through a little bit to start with about why we actually care about data security. So you've all got that taste of it from yesterday. A lot of what Tara went into was very much on the, I guess you could say the carrot side of things. Here's what we would love to get to with some of the bits there, that, acknowledging that there wasn't answers for everything, but an idea of that's what we want to try and get to and nail things down there. I'm going to come about it from a slightly different bit as well. It's probably going to be more from the stick side of things on that. So there's a few bits on there that will highlight as to some of the reasons why you really should be thinking about this with your data from the ground up. What we'll do is then look at some of the tooling that can help you get to some sort of state. So specifically around the data classification stuff that's available both with SQL Server and Management Studio for on-premises stuff, but also for Azure SQL Database in the cloud as well. And then link that into some of the ways you can then start to protect your data. So we're going to see how we can bolt together what we take from classification and pull it through into dynamic data masking and have that linkage through there. The other bit that we'll talk about a bit at the end is some static data masking and why that is something you should probably be looking at as well. When I first submitted this session, Microsoft were playing about with static data masking in Management Studio. They decided to pull it around about the same time the session got selected, so I had to juggle a little bit there and come up with something new around that side of things. So we'll look at some of the stuff that's available in there. But first of all, why do we care about data security? I'm going to look at a couple of bits around this that some of the terminology gets thrown about. There's lots of things that come in there, but what are we actually looking at? So the data security side of things is going to be how we then look at the protection of things overall. What are we looking to ensure is in place with things there? From that side of it, we then look into data privacy. And this is where a lot of the focus in this session is going to be coming in from. It's going to be looking at the privacy aspects of it there. Looking at how your data is obtained, used, destroyed, protected the whole way through its life cycle there. But unless you have some idea around your data security and what you want to do, you can't really come up with something that's useful and valuable into the privacy side of things. So some of the bits that were coming up as well, it really looks at how you've got that entire life cycle of your data. What does it start with when you're actually at the outset of creating something new? What data are you going to actually collect? Is there actually going to be anything in there that might be personally identifiable data, secure stuff, sensitive information, credit cards, ID numbers, that sort of stuff? Do you actually need to collect it in the first instance? So start from that point and go, let me only gather in the data that I actually need, and I might need something transiently. Your application may need to go, let me just get something off you to do a bit of validation, but if I don't have to ever store that and make use of it again, I don't have to do anything permanent with it. I can then throw it away after I've done that. So looking at what you actually really need to store in the first instance will help to minimize your footprint there. Once you know what you're going to take, then you need to start planning for how you're going to handle it. So start thinking about, how is my database going to be built around this? Do I need to put it in the same place as everything else? Can I hive it off somewhere else so it's more easily protected? What regulations do I need to think of as well to design that policy of how I'm going to handle that data from end to end? While you've got that life cycle going, while you've actually got that data, you need to be aware of anything that might change. So again, one of the bits that Tara mentioned was, I guess, people going, oh yeah, GDPR is not going to relate to me. I don't operate in the EU. But then I do have data on people that are from the EU citizens. Actually, now that I've studied that legislation, I find out, yes, I am impacted. So you've got that bit where legislation changes are things that you need to be dynamically working with as well, and seeing how that impacts what you have currently got with your data, what you're planning to, and make sure that you are putting something in place that takes that into account as well. Once you've built those strategies, make sure they're in place, make sure they're operating, make sure you're checking up on them, validate them as you go along. And once you get to the end of the life cycle with that piece of data, once you no longer need that, or for example, if a citizen says, I want it to be forgotten from your system, how do you actually go about getting rid of that? What is your plan that's in place to destroy or de-identify or whatever you have to do to that data, which can fit back in again to the whole life cycle of going, what am I now going to retain? Have I found out through something in this process that I no longer actually need to keep this piece of data around any of my, my customers or whatever I'm storing? Can I completely remove that from my database in total and start going around the cycle again? So it's one of those things that's continuously evolving, continuously managing, continuously monitoring on it. Some of the impacts of privacy laws that have come out, and these are a few of them that are around the globe. GDPR obviously being the big one that's got a lot of the headlines at the moment. But even things like HIP has been about for a number of years, something that you need to be aware of if you're working in that environment. The PIPEDA, Canadian-based legislation on that one, again, something to be aware of there. And for one from back home from me in Australia, the Notifiable Data Breaches Scheme, again, something that's pushing you as a company to be able to report what you've got, identify when something does happen, and what's the process that follows on there. some of the reporting times, if you do identify something like a data breach, can be as quick as 72 hours where you have to report that into legislation and have something in place to deal with it. So some of the awareness around those bits of legislation is going to be a big driver for you as well. And when you look at the impact of if you do get caught out, some of the fines now are just getting ridiculously large. It's, a massive impact. I mean, obviously, Equifax being a big famous one, but the most recent one or the biggest one in GDPR so far with British Airways the other year, £183 million is quite a big impact on things there. Again, seeing things like the Marriott one as well, multiple legislations being impacted there. So not just being fined by one set of legislation, but perhaps being fined by multiple, depending upon what the impact of your breach was. So it's certainly something there of being very, very aware of what's going on, being aware of your data and the impact it may have. Generally, it's a case of if you do find that your data has been compromised, if there has been a breach, most legislations say that you have to report into your own country's data protection regulator. Again, that might be if you've got information about people around the world. Again, things like, thinking GDPR, I'm not based in Europe, but if my database holds information on EU citizens and I find there's a breach, I've got to report back into there as well. And as I said, it can be as quick as, within 72 hours that you have to notify, otherwise you're going to be hit with more impact on there as well. So again, a couple of buzzwords that are commonly seen about data governance. One thing to be aware of, certainly in my opinion anyway, and a number of people I speak to in the industry, data governance isn't a technical solution. There's a lot of tools out there that will help you with your governance, but governance is a business process. Governance starts from the root up. Make sure that you have the culture in place in your organization to think about the data, to think about the management of the data, to think about who's got the ownership and the stewardship of that data, and build it up. And yes, there are tools that will help you once you are there, but you have to start looking at it of having the right culture in place first of all, before you start and try and implement a solution to your data governance. However, where we're looking at today, we're not driving down that road. We're just looking at one of the technical solutions that can help us within that. So assuming that we have got something in place culture-wise to look at this and to deal with it correctly and have the right mindset to go about it, we can look at classification as one of the starting points of identifying what we've got. And it's there as a starting point. It's one of the first bits of going, if I don't know what I've got, how do I know what needs to be protected? So let's have a look at classification being the starting point there for us on our journey and work out what we've got. So just to summarize that first part, the legislation is going to give us a bit of a driver there. It gives us a push to say we have to be looking at some of this stuff. But then we take our governance and classification and you look at it and saying, yes, we're going to introduce something in our culture here. We're going to have something within our organization to make sure that we are dealing with this correctly. And let's start off by looking at something like classification to see what we have and where we can go from there. So data classification, straightforward definition, it's just identifying what we've got, what types of data we have, where is it located, what level of protection does it need, some basic information around it. It's just going to be that way of making it a little bit easier for us to deal with some of those questions, to deal with the impact of a breach if it's discovered. If we know what the data is, if we've classified all the data in that database and we find out there's been a breach, we can very easily see what's the impact going to be from that. So it's kind of nice that we've got some tools coming in now with SQL Server and SQL DB that are going to help us do this a little bit easier. On the Azure side, it's part of the advanced data security offering. And it's quite nice. You've got this bit of manage it in one place in the portal with the flexibility of defining your own classifications into it. There's no need to just stick with the basic ones that are there. Excuse me, you've got that whole openness to find what's going to work for your organization, for your data, and build something out from there. With SQL Server, it started to be built in Management Studio from version 17.5. Because of the way it works, it can go back. It's not that dependent so much upon the version of SQL Server that you're actually running. So we can go back to older versions and still have something in there. So pretty much across the whole gamut of what you have in terms of supported instances at the moment, we can cover off with that. It has just changed though. So with SQL 2019, it's moved away from being stored as extended properties with your data, and it now comes in its own system tables in the way it's reported there. It does have the restriction up until this week. So has anyone downloaded Management Studio 18.4 yet? One or two hands out there. One of the cool bits on that is they've now extended out the classification aspects of it to fit in with the same way that Azure SQL Database is working, and you now have that ability to do your own custom taxonomy for your data classifications. So that's pretty cool that we can start to do that now. And the nice bit is it also backports into the older version. So it doesn't matter whether you still get the pre-2019 extended properties approach or the new system tables approach in 2019. If you're using 18.4 Management Studio, you can still customize it and apply that classification. Question?
Do we know when you upgrade to 2019, what happens if you have all the extended properties for the classification in an older version? How does that convert up?
So a question there, if we upgrade to 2019 and we've already classified our data and it's stored in extended properties, what happens with that? It still comes across. You can still use it that way with the extended properties. You probably then want to look at finding a way to script those out and reapply them with the new approach, just because it's a bit cleaner in the way it's managed. But because it's queryable out from there, and we'll cover that off with some of the demos as to how you can actually see that it wouldn't be too difficult to rescript that and to clean it out, remove the old ones and apply it in a new way. So how does it work with the classifications? What it makes use of is a recommendation engine, which is either built into the Azure SQL Database in the portal or built in through Management Studio. So effectively what it will do first of all is it will scan through your database definitions. It will get the tables and columns in your database. Now, it doesn't go through and scan the data. It's not looking to that sort of depth at the moment. It's really just looking at how you've named the columns in the tables. So it's that simple way of working out what do you possibly have. Within that and the taxonomy, it then builds up a temporary table with the patterns that you've defined in your taxonomy and how then that fits with the table names and the column names that are coming out from your scan. And from that, it builds up the list of suggestions. So we'll see that coming up in the demo of what it comes up with the questions, where these bits are defined. And you do actually have a bit of control over that as well to say, what's my highest priority? So you might have the same pattern that appears from multiple different types of classifications, and it might just be that you go, well, if I'm finding this one, let's put it in there. It does give you scope to do that. You probably want to avoid it. You want to try and make sure that what you have is well enough defined that it only appears in one place. So out of the box, it's kind of like a two-level approach to the classification. You have these higher-level bits on the labels of what's my general classification level. So if I want to tag things specifically to GDPR, a lot of those are coming in out the box. We can have it where things are just classified as publicly available. We don't care about that sort of thing. We can then drill down within those and actually specify the different information types that are there to more detail. So we can get quite granular with the way we build this out and have our definitions. There are a few bits to be aware of though. The way that Management Studio 18 has started applying it changes it a little bit slightly when you're dealing with things like temporal tables, and we'll see that coming through in the demo as well. It doesn't do in-memory tables at all at the moment. So that's one bit where it's falling down. That's something that you might have to look at separately and identify things from there. And again, where you've got things like XML and JSON, as I said, because it doesn't look at the data, it can't expand down into that and pick out anything you might have stored in there. So again, being aware of what's with those ones might mean that you want to come in and manually apply some sort of classification onto those yourself to flag that you don't know what's down there, but it might be something that's restricted down there as well. Because it's now expanding out, initially with the classification, so the default stuff out the box, picks up some of the recommendations based on some multiple languages as well. So again, making it a little bit more international across that, with the ability now to apply your own taxonomy onto it and your own rules. Obviously, you can then adjust it for your native language if it's not English, and try to put something in place there that picks out the various types of classification that you want to use. So let's have a look at building up classifications in a demo. Okay, so I'm going to start with both Management Studio 17 and 18 side by side here. The left-hand side is 17, right-hand side is 18. I just want to go through and show some of the differences that come up when we start to look at classifying our data. So I've got a 2017 instance and a 2019 instance, so I want to look at that and see the differences on both of those as we go through. So if I start looking at that on doing a classify data for our SQL Server 2017 instance. And it goes through, and this is my first bit here of going, I've gone through, I've worked out what your columns are all called. I've done that against my recommendation engine, and I've got my first set on here. If we compare that, and look at it with the Management Studio 18, one of the first things to notice there, different number of columns. So our 92 columns that we found with 17 has dropped down to 65 with our 18. And one of the reasons for that, if you notice on here with the application payments, payment methods table, and 17 it's showing my temporal ones here as well, but in 18 it's only showing the parent table. The reason for that is that, and we'll see with some of the bits in the demo, is that it identifies that under the covers. It knows that it's the same data in your parent table and the temporal table and the history table. And what it'll do is you only need to apply the classification at the top level, and it'll automatically push it down to both levels there. Whereas in 17, you have to go and actually physically do it to each one, just because of the different way that it's working on the engine there. Okay, so let's have a look at how we would go about adding a classification. So by default, it's saying, here are my recommendations. Let me maximize this one while we deal with it, and see we've got the different information types and labels across here as well. If I don't agree with what it's come up with the recommendation, I can quite simply just change the drop down here, pick something new, and go ahead with that one. But for the moment, I'm kind of happy. I'm going to say my email address. Yep, I'm happy that it's contact info and that it's GDPR relevant. And then come up here and click on my accept that one, and then click save to apply that. Likewise, back on 18, I can do the same. Notice also that as well as being slightly different in how it's dealt with some of the tables, it's changed some of the labeling as well. So the way that the classification is built up is slightly different. I'm no longer saying that that's a GDPR relevant column anymore. It is still confidential, being somebody's email address, but I no longer want to have it specifically classified as GDPR. So again, let's accept and save that one. Okay. I guess that was already there. Oh, sorry, yes, I was doing the same one. I meant to come in and do that on 19. So what you'll see on that one is that it brought it through there from my 17. It still picks it up correctly in Management Studio 18. It hasn't gone, because that's a 2017 instance, it's all stored in the same place and identifies that that's still the detail there. So there was no problem picking that up from the Management Studio 17 application of it. If I go the other way though, and do it on my 2019 instance, again, let's go with my email address, accept that one, and save that. And come back to Management Studio 17. Close that first so that it brings up the fresh one. So on this one, because Management Studio 17 doesn't understand the different way of applying it, it's only looking at the extended properties. It doesn't see that classification that we did on our 2019 instance in Management Studio 18. But what that also means is I can double classify this one. I can actually go back in and go, you know what, we can still have that applied on there as well, and save that. So just be aware that, you know, if you don't see something there, just double check what version of Management Studio you're using, what version of SQL Server you've got up and running there, and just check that you've not had it classified somewhere else that hasn't come through. Question?
Just the way you've done it, it appears as if you've labeled the field with two different labels, sensitivity labels. So which is right?
So question there is, from the way I've just gone through that one, it looks as though I've labeled the same column with two different classifications. And yes, I have on that one. Because they're stored differently, and we'll see that in a moment with some further bits in the demo where it'll start to report through. Because of the way I've done it through the different Management Studio versions, that's perfectly possible to do that. And that's why I was just saying, be aware of what version you're running with, what version of Management Studio, what version of SQL Server, and just double check, if you're going to go through the classification process, has somebody already done it? So with some of the metadata queries that we'll see in a minute, that'll be the way where you can pick that up and identify that beforehand if that's already been done. Does that answer?
So if you go back to 18.
Yep.
And which one's it going to see? Will it only see the one you did there? And if you only did the one in 17, would it still be visible in 18? Do you follow my question?
Yep, I get you now. Let's go back and actually show that one. So what it does in 18 is it picks up the one that was applied through 18, so it doesn't show in there the 17 one, but the 2017 one will show through because it's it's storing it in the same way, so it's looking to the same place. Because Management Studio 18 on SQL 2019 is looking into the new system tables to get that information, and because Management Studio 17 isn't aware of that to apply it to 2019, it's not got the same info coming back.
But will 18 on 19 see the 17?
No, it won't. As I say, so yeah, as I said from there, yeah. So the 18 on 2019 will only see the ones that were done through 18. So yes, it doesn't pick it up because it identifies it's 2019 and doesn't look at the extended properties to get that. Cool. Got there. All right. So the other bit we can do now as well, and this again is just off of current updates. We've now got it through T-SQL as well because it's dealing with it into the new system tables. the new syntax here to add a sensitivity classification. Now, if I just go back to the classification here again. And I'm just going to update that for now. And then come back to my query. So we can see that currently it's set to contact info and not applicable. I'm going to change that to be back to contact info and confidential. If I run that. It switches it back. So if there's an existing classification in place and you run the query and add it, it will update that automatically to that. So it doesn't clash, it doesn't give you a warning to say, yes, there's already one there. It just goes, yep, let's just overwrite it and apply the new one. Okay. So the other new bits, as I was mentioning, where we can now do our custom taxonomy. So the first thing we have to do is go, let's get what the current set of definitions is. So I have, let's just overwrite that one. And let's open that up in code. Okay, so what that looks like is it'll start building out through at the labels level. So we looked at that. So we had both the information type and the labels. So it builds out, you can have your label, which doesn't necessarily have to have any information types apply to it. It can just be the label on its own. So for example, our public one and general one there, we're not going down to the level of the types below it. We don't actually need anything from there. But where we've then got our confidential, we then go, let's build in the information types underneath that. And then under the keywords within the information types, this is where we start to build up what the rules are for the classification engine that will give us the recommendations. So we can see from this one, putting in some search patterns on there. Our networking one here for confidential, we're looking into things like, does it say IP address, MAC address, etc., just IP, building out that sort of information from there. Likewise with contact info, picking up things like email addresses, street addresses, cities, phone numbers, etc. So we can see from that it's a fairly straightforward, fairly standard structure from there. So what I can do is come in and go, if we look at this one, let me create a new one at the end here. So I'm going to build this in as test label is my display. I'm going to add in an information type, just a test type in there. I'm going to look for something that's got population in the name of the column. So if I come back, I can then set my information protection policy file. I can go and pick up that custom one that I've applied, and I can set that up. The interesting thing is that I can go down to my older version as well, and I can still set that. So if I come in now and look at classifying on here, and I go, do I want to update that? I can now add those in as well. So it's kind of nice that it still recognizes that and still allows us to apply it and put that in place. It only works with 18. If I go down and if I do change this one, let me set that to my test type. And come back and look at that in my older Management Studio. Did I not save that one? Or was I on the wrong one there? We'll see that it doesn't appear in our list in Management Studio 17. So it doesn't know that it's got something different to deal with there. But I'm not sure what's happened on that one, because previously that will still come through and show that classification. So I'm not sure why it's not picking it up. So it should honor that and then pick it through. Question?
So is that JSON file actually being stored in the database?
I'm not sure, because 18.4 is only just out. I haven't dived in to find out exactly where that gets loaded into.
But every time you import a new one, it overwrites. So that's what you have done available.
Yep. So I think I have a feeling it might only be for that Management Studio session at the time. I'd be able to pull it in and make use of it there. Or it may be that there is some system tables that it adds it into it as well. But I haven't had the opportunity to dive in detail yet and find out exactly where that is.
Mark,
Yes?
what level of access is required to be able to do this? Yep, it's sysadmin or
You need alter table permissions, because it is going in and picking those up. That was certainly for the pre-2019. I haven't seen anything set as a separate permission to apply it on the 2019 stuff, so I'd assume it would still be the same of alter table. Okay, so if we have a look at how that actually shows up now. So to get track of what there is from the older versions, we have to do this query across the extended properties for the table, get that information out from there. The new version of it, much simpler and cleaner in 2019, where we have sys.sensitivity classifications as a nice way of being able to pull everything out from there. So if I run this one, what we can see as well is the first one in here that I'm pulling out from the extended properties. Because I only picked that one table and didn't go in and actually explicitly add the temporal history table as well, it's only given me the one value from here. But on my 2019, where I've done it through Management Studio 18, as I pointed out, where we don't have the full list of the tables, we're not seeing the history table separately, it's automatically applied the same level down to that classification on there. So both the history and the main table have had that applied. If we look at our 2017 ones and run the same, we say, yep, 2017 doesn't have the sensitivity classifications one, and we've only got that single one from there as well. If we look in the portal for Azure SQL Database, it's under the Advanced Data Security section into Data Discovery and Classification, and we'll see it looks very similar in look and feel to the new 18.4 stuff there as well. I have the option under Configure to go in and say, let me build out my information types. So if I look at the same test type that I put into the JSON file and configure that. Again, I can hook that into a particular label, and then I can build my set of patterns on there as well. So we've got the same population one on there looking at that. And I can add any new labels on here as well and configure that up to the same bit as well. If I then look at my classification and get our recommendations, there's one bit on there that I'm finding is still a bit buggy. So with my custom classification, if I looked at, bring it up on here. If I look at my city application.cities table, I have a column there of latest recorded population that I would expect the classification engine to pick up. I'm not getting it come through. So there is still bits there I feel are a little bit buggy with it, that it's not completely picking things up there. I haven't got a response back on raising that one yet as to what the reason is behind that. So just be aware that it might be something that will still take a little bit of time to flush through and come through correctly into everything there. And again, Azure SQL Database works exactly the same way. We've got the option there to use the add sensitivity classification to that, and the same structure with 2019, obviously, on the classification metadata. And the corresponding one, if we want to remove that classification, we've got the drop sensitivity classification there to have a look at that as well. So we've gone through, question, yeah? So question, can it be used on date-time data types? It's not based on the data types as such. It's based on the column name, and you're classifying it based on the column name. So depending upon what you've named it, if you think that that is worthy of a classification, a sensitivity classification, then absolutely. So, for example, a date of birth would be considered sensitive information. So yes, you can have that tagged as being sensitive there. And it's really just looking at the column name pattern to identify it from the recommendations. Another question. So a question there with can you use any sort of fuzzy logic or regex on it? There is a limit on the matching because it is still doing like a SQL query under the covers of the recommendation engine. You've got some of the bits you can do in terms of pattern matching. So the same way as you would do with a like statement. So there's some bits in there, but no, it doesn't have a full, real sort of .NET level complexity to it to find that at the moment. So what use can we make of these classifications? So we've got that as our starting point. We've put the effort in. We've gone through. We've classified all our data there. What's the next step? What benefits do I get from that? One of those is enhancements into auditing as well. So with a classified data column, that's now a new piece of information that will be written out in your audits. So you could actually then have your scan over your audit logs, do some processing on that, look for anybody that's using these sensitive columns. So you might only be filtering down to a particular classification, but you can then see what users have been accessing it, what sort of queries have they been running over it, and get that information there and report on your sensitive usage as well. So it could be something where that's one of your tracking points to see, have I had any potential data breaches? Is there any unexpected usage of those columns? The other nice way of doing it is taking that and then saying, okay, my classification can now feed into further ways of protecting my data. So I might look at it and say, okay, my most highly confidential data, let's pull that out and let's build a script which is going to apply always encrypted onto those columns. Or if it's maybe something we know that is less of that critical nature, it might be, do we just use that for identifying levels of data masking that we want to put in place and have that coming through for the applications as well. So let's have a look at how that works, particularly in audits, first of all. Okay, so I'm just going to check I don't have any classifications in place yet. Okay, so that's clean, so we're cool on that one just now. So first of all, I'm just going to run a select statement across my database in Azure here. We're just getting some access to some of the details in here. Now I've got auditings already running on that database, so we'll just give it a moment to flush that through. And we'll just see if that's written out to the audit log yet. Cool. So we've now got that. There's a query there as in our before. Now if I add a sensitivity classification to that same table and run the same query again. So nothing's changed with our data at the moment. We're still seeing exactly the same query results coming back. But now if we jump in and have a look at our audit log, we now get this extra bit added in, which gives us both the label and information type we can extract out from the XML data in there and find out, who's been using any of those particular columns. So it's a kind of a nice enhancement out into the auditing side of things from that. So a little bit of a summary on that one. It's kind of changed a bit now, obviously. Prior to this week, Azure did have more, having that central management and the customizable taxonomy. But with the new changes in SSMS 18, we've now got the ability to apply that into our SQL Server world as well. And the 2019, with the new system tables, makes it so much easier to apply this, particularly now being having the T-SQL access to it as well, making it much easier to apply those. So the other aspect we can look at of how we take our usage there of our classifications and get something from it. So we'll have a look at data masking and how we can hook those up together as well. So we're really just looking at a way here of applying some bit of obfuscation onto our data. So we're not changing anything with dynamic data masking. It's still the same data in the database. All we're doing is saying, unless you have the elevated permissions to see this, we're not going to let you see the full set of the data. We're going to hide part of that. So it's been available since 2016. And it is defined at a column level, but we've got the application across the whole table and into the database as well in terms of the permissions. So yes, we can look at applying different functions across each of the different columns as well. And we'll have a look at some of those and see how they actually sit. So where our users don't have the elevated permissions, we're basically saying, you're not in that higher level of trust. What you're going to see is every column where we've applied that and you query that data, you're going to see something that's changed. You're going to have it masked in some way to prevent you seeing that sensitive data. But as I mentioned, we're not changing anything underneath that as well. There's some nice functions built in that we don't have to do anything too fancy with things. For an email, for example, it pulls it through in a standard format. We'll take the first letter out of the user's actual email address and then mask out the rest of it into a function like this to blur it out from there. Using the default one is going to have different values coming back depending upon the data type that we've put in place there. If we've got numeric, we can say, well, just give me a random number. I don't care what it is. we'll stick it in there. Or we can come to something where we're a bit more specific about how that mask is going to be applied. So we can do that bit of saying we're only going to mask out certain characters in it. So you probably see this as when you see reports out with credit card numbers where you get the first numeral, then X's until the last 4 digits sort of thing. That sort of thing is you need the partial function to apply something like that. There is permissions required to be able to apply this. So if we're doing it while we're creating our tables, just to create alter table permission that's allowing us to do that in the first instance, we can apply the mask within the definition there. Where we already have it, we obviously need alter table column initially, but we need additionally the alter any mask permissions on it as well. And to view the unmasked data, we need unmasked permission. Now just remember again, just reiterate it, that that's applied at the database level. So it's not an individual, apply the unmasked to that particular column. It's an all or nothing approach on that. Few restrictions with masking as well. We can't combine it with always encrypted. So we're looking at that as perhaps being masking as our secondary level in our classifications. Our most sensitive, most critical stuff, we probably want to look at applying encryption onto. Our next level down, maybe we just want to mask it. There's some restrictions on column types that we can't apply that to as well. And there is ways around it with computed columns, although we can't apply it directly. If one of the dependent columns in there is masked, that will be applied through on the computed column as well. It's not insurmountable though. There are well-published ways of hacking around and exposing or breaking the mask. So again, as I said, it's not something I'd be looking at for my most critical data. I'd certainly be looking at that as encrypted rather than masked to look at from there. But obviously you can either do it through brute force of trying to rework it, or just simply being clever with your queries. Using some carefully selected predicates, you can narrow that down and easily identify what the value is that's coming back from there. So again, that combination along with auditing and masking might be something where you start to look for anybody attempting a brute force hack onto your mask columns from there. Nice and straightforward way of we set things up here. I'll run through this one on a demo as well so you actually see it, but the ability to query the metadata for our data masking, we can use some dynamic SQL here to build out a script that's then going to apply a data mask to all of those types. So if we go through and say, let me pick out all my columns that have been classified with confidential email as my information type and label, I could put that in as the filter into this query, and immediately I've got a script now which will mask all of the columns in my database that have got an email address. So let's have a look into some of the bits around that. Okay, so if we look at it beforehand, we've got the full access to the data on here. There's nothing that we're protecting in any way as yet. Oh, sorry. Flip on that way. So our query on here, and we're working on a 2019 one. Okay, so if I query this for what I've set up with my test type, I get my script out from here. I can drop that in. So we get that. We can now apply our mask onto there. And then what I'm going to do is create another user on there. I'm going to give it permissions to select from the table there. And we're going to run as that one. So as we can see, that's now had the mask applied onto our email address column. So we get that starting point, as I said, with just the first letter there, and then everything else masked out from there. If I then give that the unmasked permission, we go back and you can see the full amount back at the original stuff there as well. So nice and straightforward. I've been able to get through onto that. Okay. So a number of functions available with data masking there. Our real values don't get changed. We've still got them. They're not impacted under the covers, but be aware that you can get access to those if you've got sufficient permissions to query the data and be able to spend the time just inferring what's through from there. Question, yes?
Are all of these things available in standard edition as well as enterprise?
So a question is, are these available in the other editions? Yes, they are. Data masking's across every single edition. So question there, we can do it by roles rather than individual users? Yes, absolutely. So it's again, unless you've been granted the unmask permission, so it's kind of the other way around. It's not as if you say, these ones get masked, it's these ones get unmasked. So you'd only have that perhaps for your database owner level permission or something like that, that's got the unmask. So static data masking. So what we've talked about here with dynamic, reiterating the fact that we're not changing the underlying data. It's exactly as it was, nothing changed there, and it's only at query time that we see something different. When we look at static data masking, we are actually looking at changing the data underlying it. So when would you maybe think about using this? So some of the scenarios that come up is obviously, looking at dev test environments. Do I actually need to be running full production data in my dev test? What's the risk of that? If I've got it on my laptop and my laptop gets stolen, there's my production database gone as well. There's that data potentially exposed to everybody. But if I'm working with a masked set of data, okay, I still get the description of what I need to develop with. I still have the right structure of all my tables. If I craft it well enough, I've probably got a good representation of what my data set's actually like as well. So again, I'm protecting things that way. You may have to send something out. There may be third parties that you go, I need to send you a copy of my database for some advanced troubleshooting. Again, do you really want to send your full production data and what's there, not knowing exactly what their protection rules are going to be around the data they get? So again, some other bits there of how you want to actually protect that data when it goes out and leaves your environment. So in this scenario, we're actually physically changing and replacing our sensitive data with a masked copy in some way. So how we mask that, it might be that we use similar functions to the dynamic side. So we might blank it out if we don't want to see anything in particular there. Or we can look at something that replaces that data with new values that are similar, but just made up sort of idea. So we might have a set of names, standard first names that we use, and we just go in and replace randomly, change the first names of everybody. That's one way of applying something onto there. The main bit is that when you do this, you don't want to make it something easy to go back and infer what the original values were. So the more you can do in terms of a replacement from some obscure set, some unrelated set, the better that's going to be from there as well. So we don't have anything inbuilt in SQL Server to do this. The only way we can do that is to start looking at some third-party tools. There is quite a few out there. Some of the common ones you'll see, Redgate have got some good data masking stuff. They have a nice way with the data generator product as well, of being able to build a data set that you can then swap in and use. So there's some nice bits out there. Commvault, I know, does one as well. Informatica does stuff. So some of these big tools companies will have a product that will be able to do that and apply that. Generally, the types of things you'll see is as substitution, so just replace value A with value B, and often looking at that external data set to pick that up. So again, something like generate a data set with Redgate's data generator, and then maybe pull that in and overwrite your existing values in the database with that. Shuffling is another common one, where we actually move the values about within the row. So the value that was in row 2 might become now the value in row 25, and do a random shuffle of things about there. Again, thinking back to the not easily reconstructible for your source data, you'd want to ensure that a shuffle wasn't moving everything by the same amount. Because then it's going to be really easy just to get back to what you had. A numeric variance, this is one where you may have that unless you're randomizing what your variance is. If you're going with the same value, then it does change everything the same, but again, you'd need to have a confirmed value to go back from to work out what the shuffle value was. It depends on what your data is. If it's something you just want to have, it's just a different number, that might be valuable to do that. Or you could apply a mask, so you could actually do that bit of take the similar sort of outputs that we saw with the dynamic data masking and actually apply those in and make that change fixed and permanent into the database as well. So again, that completely blocks out some of the data that's there and obfuscates that enough. A few considerations though, the things you want to make sure that your tool or your approach does, where you've got combinations in your columns, it has to work the same way. So for example, if you've got a full name column in your database as well, in your table, that's a combination of your first name and last name, if you change the values in first name and last name, you want to make sure that's consistent going through. So where you have that combined column, make sure that the same thing is applied across that. Otherwise, on the example there, you end up with some bizarre stuff with Helen Andrews being known as Mark Fisher. Across the table, where we're changing things or change the value, a value that repeats in multiple rows, if we want to have representative data, so if we want to ensure that our statistical queries across the data set are going to be the same in production as with the mask copy, then we have to make sure that we do that same update across everything there as well. For something like that, where you've got a key value like the employee ID, then yes, obviously you want to make sure that anything that's related to that one gets the same update as well. If we're looking across tables, where we're then looking at joins and foreign keys across tables, again, that's another bit where we need to be aware of, are we going to maintain that same linkage across? Are we going to break foreign keys by going, we've changed it here, then changed it differently there, and now we no longer get a link between them. So again, being aware of what you've got across your tables as well is important when you're considering a masking product. I've got a quick demo on one here. It's quite simplistic. There is, has anyone used DBA tools? We've got a few of you with hands up there, so you're familiar with that. Those that haven't, if you are working in PowerShell at all with your databases, get the DBA tools module. It just makes your life so much easier. Okay, so I've got that. I've reset things on there. What we're going to look at is a few examples again on here. Same data set. We're looking at the people table. We're gathering a couple of bits out from it. Ultimately, I want to get this masked with the email address and not have to worry about applying permissions, so that we've got the dynamic data masking. I want to change this permanently. So there's a couple of bits that we would consider off using the DBA tools module. So first bit is we need to ensure that we have the module loaded. And then I'm just going to set up bits for my connection in here. So setting up with to my 2019 server and set my database on there. So let me just run that bit. So the first function that they have is invoke DBA DBPII scan. And it does a similar thing to what we saw with the classification engine. That it's going to look across my schema and work out, is there anything in there that might be of concern that we want to, consider for our masking. So we'll scan across that. I've only got 2 tables in the database, so it should be pretty quick from there. And if I then have a look at that and see what is PII, it's picked out a few bits from there. Let me just extend that up so we can see a bit more on it there. So it picks out, from my customers table, my postal code is in a location category. It fits in with a zip code. It's a known name, so it's something that's fairly standard to pick out that type from there. And it gives a recommendation of a type of masking that it would work with. What this one's built upon, if anyone's heard about the bogus framework, so it's something that's there. It's a framework across various languages and tools that you can make use of to apply that sort of masking. So it uses the same sort of classifications from there.
It's not using the same kind of applications that we were using in SSMS.
Correct. It's a question there. It's not, is it using the same classifications as an SMS? No, it's not. This is a different product that's got the setup for that, and it's actually far more generic and far more complete, I would say, than the Management Studio ones in terms of what type of data it can look for. So the other bit we can then do from there is we can create a masking config file. So I'm going to take this PII object, apply that as the input. It's going to look at that, make use of the framework and go, let me give you a recommendation on a configuration for your masking. So we'll run that one. So that should just take a minute to go there. So it gives me an output file. Let's have a look at that one. Get the right one. It's my masked importers one, that one. So again, this is the structure of what it'll find from there. So it's used what it picked up from the scan to get the potential PII columns. It then comes in and goes, here's the recommendation of what we think we'd put in here. So for example, on my person ID column here, so it's picked up, it scanned it, it knows it's an integer type. It's got an idea of what maximum values you might want to apply onto that. It's then suggesting a masking type, so it's just saying, I think you should apply a random number onto this one. That could be cool. Whether it's nullable across there. So this gives me then the core type of approach that I'd want to put into this to have a look at that. So again, on the name, it's going to pick it up as a character. What it does on this type of thing is it goes for the min and max value in here. It basically says, what is the length that I should have put into this. And it's basically just going to take a whole set of characters, so basically all the letters of the alphabet that you make available to it, and it will just put them in random order. So it'll make it reasonably nonsense, but of this sort of length between 25 and 50 characters, that sort of idea on there. This one's a better example of it there, where it says, here's the string that I'm going to use to make available for the substitutions, and do it as a random generation on there. So what I'm going to look at is just a more simplified version of things. I've cut it down to just my email address again for that table. I'm going to say that the masking type that it comes up with from here is an internet one, because that contains the subtype of email. So it is going to apply an actual email type masking across from there. So if I go back to PowerShell, I'm then going to say, let me invoke that. So I'm telling it again that it's in my people table, my email address column, and it's picking up my version of the configuration file from there. So I run that. We'll see that that's now updating all the rows in there and running a query against that. And if I now come back, I come back in and look at here. It's on my masked importers, not on the unmasked one. So we can now see if I pull that out to the side. We can see it's actually gone in and picked up some randomness from there with the email addresses and substituted that across on top of what was there in my previous one to see that. So that's one way you can use it with some tooling there to apply some static data masking. The nice bit about DBA Tools one obviously is that it is completely free. You don't have to fork out anything to do that. You will have to do a good bit more work to try and get your consistency across things where you need it. So you might have to run it through this for certain bits and then reapply that across in some way to your other tables, because otherwise you're likely to get unrelated data coming across on them there. So somewhere around that, when would you want to use static data masking? What types of replacements that you tend to get across the various tools? So yes, there is nothing native with SQL Server or with the Microsoft tools, but there are a large number of third-party ones to make use of, or roll your own. Work it out in some way that you want to apply something yourself. It might be something that you build up through your DevOps pipelines, so that when you're deploying to your dev test, you have a set of queries that you run over it, which will make your consistent changes across the data that's there, and apply that and give you a more secure development environment to use for that. That covers what I want to talk about. Does anyone have any further questions? Yes?
Many companies use the static data masking to actually do the GDPR or right to forget. For example, you may have lots of data that is not sensitive, but you can't get rid of all that data for that person because you may be using it for longitudinal studies or warehousing or downstream.
Yeah, so a question there, has there been examples of companies using static data masking in the sort of right to be forgotten type environment? I haven't had anything that's been impacted yet. It's something that's still, for us, it's been that sort of kick up the backside type approach of we need to be thinking about this now. So yeah, pretty much in that same scenario of what Tara was describing the other day of, yes, it's not there yet. This is something that's now that we're pushing in our company is looking at that from the ground up for anything that's new and thinking about it in advance. So we haven't had anything that has impacted that way yet with anything. On the right to be forgotten, yes, you'd probably want to look at some way of scrubbing out that data and retaining it if you do still need the statistical type approach. If it's more in a transactional type of thing, you're probably just looking to delete the records out completely in some way. But yeah, there's also the concerns, what do you do with backups? You might have one regulation saying you have to retain your backups for X number of years. You can't go in and fiddle with that backup, but that backup contains that person's data. So there's still lots of conflicts out there as to how can it all bolt together and be a consistent approach across things, which is still the challenge and still panning out from that. Yeah. At the back, yeah.
So is there any point that if somebody's data belongs to the company?
So So if I get the question right, so is there a scenario where the person's data becomes owned by the company? So regulation-wise, and my understanding of GDPR is that no, that does not happen, that you have that right within there. Although the other bit I've seen with examples is a geo-blocking type approach to it. So you have the right to be forgotten in this legislation, but this legislation doesn't trump some other country's legislation that's conflicting on that one. So I have seen bits discussing on if the client machine is from the EU, then they won't see that information, but the rest of the world might be able to see it from there. So you've got those interesting quirks as to how does that happen and what is the other legislation. But in general, no, your personal information should never be owned by somebody else. It's your information. That right should still take precedent over everything there, in my opinion. At the back, yes.
For data classification, how do you source control that in 2019?
Good question. So yes, for data classification, how do you source control it? Easier now with 2019 with the fact that you can script it all. So you could have those scripts based into your source control pipeline and making sure that they're applied as part of any deployment. So in that way is far easier. Again, I guess with the extended properties, how you're deploying that out, it's a bit more work to script those out as well, but it can be done. So there is ways to do it through that one. And obviously your config file where you're loading that in to say, here's my definitions, you could keep that separately as well and have it as a source controlled version. Anyone else? Yes?
With the actual classification tool, is there a way or an API to hook into that to execute it?
So the question is, with the data classification tool, is there any sort of API? There is not, but in the way that it's working, I guess you've just got it through script anyway, so it's really just any sort of SQL client works in that term. Thank you all for coming along. Please remember to fill in your evaluation forms and enjoy the rest of the conference.